is the strongest of all powers, the force of all forces. For it overcometh every subtle thing, and doth penetrate every solid substance. From the Emerald Table. Virgo potens, Virgo clemens, Virgo fidelis, powerful virgin, merciful virgin, faithful virgin. From the Laurentian litany. Here we are, friends, at letter 11, Force, from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. And here's another one of his sophiological letters, and this one explicitly so. I mean, strongly, explicitly sophiological, and strongly Mariological as well. So this image, right, of this virgin closing the mouth of a lion. Now, one of the traditional interpretations of this card is of the constellation Virgo, which follows Leo, closing the lion's mouth, or, Virgo is the harvest. So she's closing the harsh heat of the lion as the cycle of the year moves toward the harvest. So that's one way to look at it, and of course, there's another way to look at it, or several ways to look at it. But Tomberg jumps right into a discussion of implicit religion or natural religion in regards to this card, which is starting right off in sophiology, and he talks about the hunger and thirst for righteousness that is a kind of prayer, for truth and for beauty, and likewise through each act of generosity and every expression of respect, admiration, and adoration. Yes, the world is full of implicit religion. Right? And further he says, these cascades of energy cannot bear in themselves anything else other than a certain testimony of the fundamental presence of God, that is, the meaning and purpose of being alive. This is what natural religion is. This is what he sees in this, depicted in this card. And I thought I could read a little bit to you from a seemingly, totally not esoteric source, but worth your perusal, I think. It's the French philosopher, contemporary French philosopher, Jean-Luc Nancy. His book, Adoration, The Deconstruction of Christianity Too. He has a couple things to say about adoration here. Let me see if I can find it. Here he says, the gift of the world calls for adoration. It invites us to adoration, commits us to it, arouses it. But what's more, this gift opens the possibility, if not the necessity, of adoration. Not that it obliges us, as a giver can oblige the receiver, but this gift without giver, this gift that in itself is simply equal to the event of the world, already in itself constitutes a gesture of adoration. This gift turns toward the infinite, or rather, it bears to the infinite the real of the nothing, of which it is the disenclosure. And his term he uses, disenclosure, very kind of common move in French phenomenology to complicate terms or invent neologisms like this. So we have disclosure, which in a Heideggerian sense is, and this is in phenomenology, when we attend to things, they disclose themselves to us. When we attend in generosity and reverence and patience, they can disclose themselves to us. They can tell us who they are. So that's one of the implicit meanings in this term, disenclosure. And the other was what this enclosure, right, which still keeps enclosed in the being in which we're relating, to which we're relating. So there's a kind of movement out and a movement in. So the movement out is the disenclosure, which the revelation to us, but it's also our movement in to the phenomenon itself. And Nancy is talking about this in terms of our relationship to what is. And I'll give you another one. Adoration is a relationship to excess, where ends and reasons are concerned, a relationship to existence as this excess itself, just as much for the existence of the world as for the existence of life, thought, and any kind of tension going beyond intention. And one more I can find for you is toward the end here. And he says, what I name adoration would be only the consideration of what in relation among us to oneself, to the world, opens to the infinite, without which there would be no relation in the full sense of this word alone. Perhaps can take on, but only rapport, liaison, or connection. Right? Read that again. What I name adoration would be only the consideration of what in relation among us, to oneself, to the world, opens to the infinite, without which there would be no relation in the full sense that this word alone perhaps can take on, but only rapport, liaison, connection. Right? And he is clearly intruding upon this space that Tomberg's investigating in this letter with natural religion. You know, there's this implicit religiosity or religiousness that is disclosed or disenclosed in Nancy's language in our relationship, our integral, authentic, not compromised by ego or whatever it might be, relationship to the world. That's what he's talking about, and that's exactly what Tomberg's talking about as well. And as he says, Tomberg says, going back to Tomberg, page 270, he's talking about how life proceeds from a holy source, that it flows towards an end of supreme worth, and that it is gift, benediction, and vocation. Words that echo Nancy, from what I just read from Nancy. And this also reminds me of William Blake's beautiful phrase at the end of his Song of Liberty: "For everything that lives is holy." Right? This is sophiology right here. This is a beautiful affirmation of creation. I remember it. After every day in Genesis, God creates. He says, "It is good." And God said that it was good. It was good. And so this is what leads Tomberg to say in 271 that we can only conclude through this kind of natural religion, this authentic, sincere relationship to the creation in which we are embedded. The source of all life is religion, conscious or unconscious. That is, perception of the presence and reaction to the presence. Right? And you have to think that this, even the most materialistic of ecologists, or people who have a relationship to nature but not to religion, or they could even be atheists. But I think their dedication to creation is implicitly religious, and probably just waits for an awakening or something, some movement, maybe on their part. And perhaps it's a learning to disarm ideology, even people in kind of radical environmentalist poses. I mean, there's something there which is implicitly religious, and unfortunately, it's often also implicitly and misanthropic. But be that as it may, there's something going on there we have to recognize, and hopefully in time this could flower into something more meaningful even. And Tomberg continues to discuss this from natural religion. He leads into, the obvious, but it's not all good, right? Nature does bad things, right? We've talked about this already. But he talks about what is the antidote to those bad things. Well, he says, but the baptism and confirmation with fire and spirit, the sacraments of love, surpass those of natural religion. They bear forgiveness and healing to fallen nature. So, the sacraments, vessels of grace, being open to grace again. I mean, it's a recurring theme in this book. And then Tomberg moves into a discussion of conviction. I mean, how are we convicted of things? How does a radical environmentalist become convicted of something? How does Edith Stein become convicted of something? How does anybody become convicted of something? And he says there are two different kinds of arriving at conviction. One can be illumined by the serene clarity of contemplation, or one can be swept away by the electrifying flood of passionate arguments aiming at a desired end. The faith of the illuminated is full of tolerance, patience, and calm steadfastness, like crystal, and the faith of those who are swept away is, in contrast, fanatical, agitated, and aggressive. I think we've all seen examples of this. And he points to, very often, he goes back to Marx as an example of, and Marxist kind of agitation as the conviction of the electrifying conviction of the raging water version, right? Well, you get swept up in mobs or swept up in groupthink. But then he doesn't use this as an example, but the conviction of contemplation. I mentioned Edith Stein a second ago, also known as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, the German Jewish philosopher who became a Carmelite nun and was killed in Auschwitz. Now, if you know about her story, she was a kind of agnostic, atheist, Jewish philosopher. She was a phenomenologist. She was Husserl's assistant. She was visiting a friend, and her friend, for the week or whatever, and her friend had gone out, and the friends had the autobiography of Teresa of Avila, which figures strongly into the next chapter we'll talk about on the Hanged Man. And since the people, friends were out, Edith decided she'll read this book. So she sat down and read the entire autobiography of Teresa of Avila in one sitting. And when she finished it, she was no longer an agnostic atheist. She was, well, in her soul anyway, she was a Christian, if not formally. And because she read this book and said, "This is the truth." So that's conviction. That's conviction. I mean, this was not an emotional, easily agitated or excited thinker. I mean, if you read Edith Stein's philosophy, she's very methodical, very clear, very exacting in the way she thinks. So for her to say this is truth makes one consider, right? She was not swept away by the crowd, by the greedy. She was not greedy for success. In fact, this was not a prudent move for her at the time. And Tauber continues on page 272. He said, in the world there are therefore two kinds of faith, two kinds of instinctivity, two different ways of seeing the world, and two different ways of looking at it. There is the open and innocent look, which desires only to reflect the light, that is, which only wants to see. And there's the scrutinizing look, which seeks to find and lay hold of its desired prey. Now, I can't help but think, and this is in my book, Incarnation of the Poetic Word, I have a chapter on agapeic criticism, which is precisely what he's talking about here. It's a criticism, in literary criticism, that wishes to see what's really there, that approaches things in reverence. There's a very Goethean approach to it. But this, and I decided to write that because I was discouraged, disappointed, disgusted with schools of literary criticism that seek to do exactly what he says here, that scrutinize, which seek to find and lay hold of their desired prey. So Marxist criticism does this, feminist criticism does this to a certain degree, post-colonial criticism does this. Just about every school of criticism in literary studies these days does exactly this. They already come at a piece of literature with an axe to grind. They're trying to see how it represents oppression of the working class, or oppression of women, or whatever it's, and you can never take it on its own terms. I can't really, it made me, as an English major in college and as a PhD in English, I kind of bucked against this trend, coming from, kind of inspired by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote in his Biographia Literaria that basically said, anyone who tells me there's a deficiency in a work of art or work of literature doesn't tell me anything I couldn't figure it out for myself. But he adds, but he who shows me delights or illumination in a work of literary criticism, now he does me a favor, right? That's you're helping me then. You're helping me see something beautiful. So that's been my approach in teaching literature, is to do that, and not to do it out of what Harold Bloom has called the schools of resentment approach. I don't, I remember telling a friend of mine, lamenting this, and he said, yes, that's what we do. We breed their love of literature out of them in the English department. It's true. So anyway, to undigress, Tauber continues, and he talks about how this, when he's drawing on, as you know, the image of the sea of crystal in the Revelation, and he talks about the sea of crystal is that position, as that state of contemplation, and he opposes it in the Revelation with the raging torrent that comes from the mouth of the dragon, which is the other kind of conviction, right? But then he continues with his discussion and talks more about the apocalypse, but the woman clothed with the sun, and compares her or contrasts her with the woman sitting on a scarlet beast. And he says in 273, the former is the soul of cosmic non-fallen nature, the sun, moon, and stars, and the latter is the soul of terrestrial fallen nature, gold, jewels, pearl, and beast. The first is a mother, the second is a prostitute. The one is perception of that which is above and reaction to that which is perceived. Now, of course, the first is also Sophia. And if you'll remember, in the epigraph to the letter 6, the lovers, it was a quote from the Proverbs, but it was a quote when the prostitute is speaking. So even in Proverbs, you have that juxtaposition of Virgin Sophia with this prostitute, you know, with the way of the serpent and the way of grace. And also remember we talked, I can't remember what letter it was, we talked about Terrence Malick's film, The Tree of Life. And in there, one of the first utterances we hear is the mother in a voiceover says, the nuns told us there were two ways, the way of nature and the way of grace. So clearly, if Malick isn't drawing on Tomberg, he's drawing on the same inspiration, the way of nature and the way of grace. And let's continue then. Now, in his discussion of the Sophia figure from the Revelation, he gets into he doesn't really, I thought he would say more about it, but to fill in the blanks, he talks about, and this is from 273 to 274. Let me see if I can catch it. Yeah, it said, evolution, orthogenesis, natural selection, mutations in the hereditary mechanism, avatars, Advent, Christmas, so many problems and ideas referring to the one great expectation and the one great hope for evolution to attain its ultimate level of flowering to give its flower, for orthogenesis to produce the being of the culmination of evolution, for natural selection to result in the future Superman, for whom the mechanism of heredity to bring its optimum to the light of day, for what we worship above to manifest amongst us below, for the Messiah to come, for God to become man. Now, you kind of have to know a little bit about the background. There's a few spots in here where he's drawing on Steiner in particular. But the idea, though, with what he's talking about, evolution leading to the birth of Christ. What's the point? What? Christ isn't a product of evolution. Well, the understanding coming from Steiner is that, you know, and Tomberg talks about this in his lectures on the Old Testament from his anthroposophical days, where you look in Genesis in particular, but, you know, with Jacob breeding the goats and the sheep, and this idea of heredity, creating the right body. And the idea was that the mission of the Jewish people was to create the right body for the Messiah, in which the Messiah could incarnate, in which God could take possession. They had the right body, which is why they were the chosen people. Now, if you're thinking from, I know, a contemporary Jewish perspective, this might seem a little bit off-putting or heretical. But from a Christian perspective, it kind of makes sense that why would there be a chosen people? This is what they were chosen for, in a way, right? For God to incarnate. I mean, and so who in particular does that heredity relate to? Well, the Virgin Mary. Because if we take the virgin birth as true, the Immaculate Conception, not the Immaculate Conception, but the virgin birth and the conception by the Holy Spirit, then that would indicate that the body of Christ, the body of Jesus, came from the Virgin Mary, right? It was identical almost. In fact, you would have to say identical. Parthenogenesis, born of a virgin. And in fact, interesting book, slightly esoterically related. It's by Jeffrey Ash, the Arthurian scholar. But he wrote a book on the Virgin, which is one of the better books I've read on Mary. So, and he talks about this too, about, well, you know, if we take the virgin birth or the virgin birth on its own terms, then he must have been identical to Mary. Or not like identical twins, but very close. I mean, genetically very close, right? So she, and this is what Tomberg says here. on page 274. This is therefore what is conveyed by the good news. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. John 1:14. Free nature, natural religion, the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and on her head a crown of stars. The Virgin Sophia was present in Mary. And it is thus that the soul of non-fallen nature gave birth to the divine Word. Right? That's a pretty bold statement. Right? And of course, mainstream theology is kind of suspicious of sophiology, and this isn't going to help. Right? But then he continues, and this is important to remember. Natural religion is now flooded in the radiance, glory of supernatural religion, and non-fallen nature has become a dispensator and cooperator in the miracles of the new evolution, the evolution of the second birth. Right? And it connects it to the card. Nevertheless, the Virgin is the principle of force. That is, the principle of cooperating in with the realization of supernatural acts of the Holy Spirit. Right? So he's taking the imagery of the card now to be the Virgin Sophia, her role in taming fallen nature and assisting its elevation into a supernatural nature. We talked about this earlier with our discussion of what happened on the cross when the blood and water hit the earth and began the regeneration of the earth itself. And he talks about, and so here's, and I think this is really important on the bottom of 274. He's talking about, I guess, the importance of redemption of what is there, and not starting clean from something brand new. And he says, even the miracle of miracles, the resurrection itself, was not the creation of a new body, but rather the transformation of the crucified body. The latter had to disappear from the tomb in order that the resurrected one could appear to Mary Magdalene and the others. But, we're not starting with a new nature. It's a redemption of nature, or transfiguration of nature, right? And this leads him to conclude that virgin nature, therefore, has her part in all the miracles. And it's 275. And it is virgin nature participating actively in the miracles of divine magic, which is the subject of the 11th arcanum of the tarot force, representing a woman victorious over a lion, holding its jaws open with her hands. The woman does so with the same apparent ease, without effort, with which the magician of the first arcanum handles his objects. Right? And again, we're in the realm of non-fallen nature. Now he also follows on page 276 with a discussion of what he doesn't owe to anybody. And I won't read the whole thing, but I owe nothing to early Christian authors who attack paganism, nor to pagan authors who attack Christianity. I owe nothing to the learned Protestant doctors of the 16th century and the academics of the Enlightenment and the Revolution of the 18th century have taught me nothing. Also, I owe nothing to the militant savants of the 19th century, and the revolutionary spirits of our century, such as Lenin, have not given me anything. These polemics. Now, he didn't live to see it, but imagine had he seen the internet or social media, which I think, there's a diabolical element to that, in that it thrives on polemic. And think about this. It's evil. It thrives on polemic and generates all this energy of divisiveness and anger and angst. To what end? What does that energy feed? And it certainly feeds something, and it feeds corporations, feeds governments, I think, who monitor these things. And it feeds the political will. But if there's something else it feeds too, I think, which is not so human. And he contrasts this, and I think pardon me, he contrasts this angst-ridden this polemical aspect of human culture with the Sophianic aspect of creation, right? And this is and we can think about that polemic as a kind of force, kind of a diabolical force, whereas the force represented by Sophia, or in this card, is very different. And he says here at the bottom of 276, top of 277, the force which is at work here is that of the Virgin, talking about the good force, which the doctors of the Zohar call Shekinah, whilst the energy which electrifies Polemesis is that of the serpent. So think about that next time we're having a Facebook argument. The force of life and electrical energy. Right? And then he speaking of this force of life and electrical energy. I mean, what is the antidote to dealing with, even if you just work on the internet, or if you just work on a computer, so you write or whatever happens to be, and I do this. What's the antidote to it? Nature is the antidote. Getting away from it and getting into nature is the best antidote besides liturgy that I know. Even reading isn't the same. And reading's, it's very good, but somehow plugging into supernature as filtered through nature is very healing of that electrical serpent energy. And this leads him into a discussion of Zoe and Bios, Greek words that are often translated as life. Both of them translated as life, but they don't mean that. Or they don't mean it the way, they don't have such a limited understanding as we would have on our understanding of the word life. Right? Life, what does it mean for us in English? Well, here's what he says. Scripture has two different terms in Greek for life. Zoe and Bios. Actually has another one, Psyche or psyche. The first signifies vivifying life, and the second, derived life. Zoe is to Bios as free nature is to necessitated nature. Sorry. Now, I'll read a little bit more of his definition. It is Bios which flows from generation to generation, and it is Zoe which fills the individual in prayer and meditation, in acts of sacrifice, into participation in the sacred sacraments. Zoe is vivification from above in a vertical sense. Bios is vitality, which, although it once issued from the same source above, passes in the horizontal from generation to generation. Right? Now, Bios, he says, biological life flows in the domain of the serpent. Let's talk about that. So, Bios, different ways to understand Bios, and he's touching on most of them. But in the way it's usually used in the New Testament or in Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, is Bios means the way something works. So if you're looking at a frog, the Bios of a frog concerns, it's starting from a cluster of eggs, then becoming a tadpole, then going through metamorphosis into a frog, and what they eat is tadpoles, what they eat is frogs, what their mating cycle is. That's Bios. For human beings, we can connect it to our biology as well, but we can also connect it to what we do for a living. What's our Bios? What's our way of living? Right? And that is essentially the way life is understood in the greater culture, right? It's what we do, right? It's what makes us alive. It's what not even what makes us alive. It's what our biological structures dictate, and it's also what we do for a living, how we live our lives. Do we live in communities? It's that kind of stuff, right? Well, contemporary culture pays no attention, zero, to Zoe, which is the other things Talbert is talking about here. Now, in the New Testament, almost exclusively when the word is translated as life, it's the word Zoe. When Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he says, "Life is Zoe." Right? I am the thing that makes things alive. That's what that life means. I am that which life is. Now, science doesn't talk about this life at all. It dismissed it in the 19th century, 18th century, as a fit place for investigation or scientific investigation, or a fit subject for scientific investigation. But on the other hand, going back to the New Testament, when Jesus says, "No greater love hath a man than this, than to put down his life for his friends," that life is not even bios. That life is psyche or psyche, right? So it's psyche as psyche or psyche is the life that I possess, the thing that makes me get up in the morning, literally, But it's not the same thing as the force of life that is in all nature. It's like reminds me of Dylan Thomas's poem, "The force that through the green fuse drives my green age," right? There's some, and this is Zoe. That's the fact that there's life at all, and who is the source of that life? Christ. Now, if you want to read an interesting book on this topic, I think it's really a fine book. Carl Karenyi, we talked about him a little bit in reference. The quotes from Jung earlier in the book from The Science of Mythology. It was a book written, or that book that Jung wrote in tandem with Carl Karenyi, the Swiss mythologist. And his book, Dionysus, it's Figure of Pure Life or something like this, but Dionysus is the main title of the book. It's a really fascinating book. And he really gets into this idea of Zoe and Bios, because for him in Greek mythology, Dionysus represents Zoe. He can't be contained. Almost like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan is a wild lion, right? Can't be tamed. There's something in this life that can't be tamed, right? But it's inherently good. So, and then Tomberg gets into a discussion of his Mariology. And he starts with the famous, he's asking what is virginity, but he starts with the famous description or words of wisdom or Sophia from Proverbs 8, which I won't read, but it's Proverbs 8, 22-30. And then he talks about Mary or Sophia as co-redemptrix, co-creatrix, co-sanctificatrix, Virgo Mater, Regina. This formula summarizes the thoughts relating to the principle of virginity. Here is the place to point out that principles do not exist separately from the beings who incarnate and manifest them. Principles are always immanent. This is why the reality of the principle of the divine is God. The reality of the principle of the divine word is Jesus Christ. And the reality of the principle of fertile and productive virginity is Mary Sophia. Mary Sophia represents, that is, incarnates and manifests the principle of virginity, that of non-fallen nature. that of natural religion and that of force. She is the central individuality, the queen of the whole domain in question. She is the conscious individual soul who is the concrete ideal, the queen of virginity, motherhood, and creative, productive, or queenly wisdom, right? So he's not holding back about this Mary stuff, is he? Interestingly, though, and he gets into Marian apparitions, and he says, the meetings with the Blessed Virgin are so numerous and so well attested that one must certainly at least admit their objective reality. I think it's true. Not only is it true, I mean, there are films of it. I mean, there's I don't know if there's a video, but there are photographs of the Virgin appearing in a church in Egypt in like 1963, I think, early 60s, and she was so present that people who weren't even Christian could see her. I mean, the Muslims said, "Hey, look, there's the Virgin Mary." You can find pictures of it on the internet. I can't remember the name of the church. But if you look for Marian apparition Egypt, you will find it. Also, and this is one that Tomberg says he investigated, is Our Lady of All Nations. He went to investigate that personally when he was in the Netherlands. And he came away, as he says, convinced it was true. And I have an interesting story, though. Now, here, you can see, is the image you probably have seen of the Lady of All Nations, and if not, you've seen it now. Here's a funny story. Now, there's a pretty decent collection of sophiological writings that were put together by Father Thomas Schipflinger. I think he was German. He was a German priest, might have been Austrian, and he spent a lot of time as a missionary in China. I mean, the decades. But through all of his life, he compiled all this information, all these sources on Sophia, and he published in German a book, Maria Sophia, which was translated into English, and I think in 1997 or around there, by my friend James Morganti, who I met through Robert Powell. It was a long time ago. I met somebody, I don't know how I got Robert Powell's phone number. He was living in Germany. I called him in Germany. He told me I should talk to his friend who lived closer to me, who was James Morganti. Got to be pretty good friends with James. We corresponded quite a bit. And James was translating Father Schipflinger's book at the time. And he was telling me about what he was translating. And then as I was going through, I can't remember what I was reading, but I was in a letter to James. I said, I can't help but think that there's this intimate connection of the Rose Cross with Sophia. In fact, I told him, I said, I think there is such a thing as the White Rose Cross, and I think the White Rose Cross is the cross of Sophia. It's almost like she's coming right out of the Rose Cross. And then he sent me this card. And interestingly enough, I think that was his saying, yes, you're right. I think you have a point. This actually is, there he is, Father Schipflinger. This is the kind of card that was published at the Golden Jubilee, Golden Anniversary of Father Schipflinger's ordination to the priesthood, so his 50th anniversary to the priesthood. And this is what he chose as his cover. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Father Schipflinger died in, I think, 1981. No, 2001. So just a few years after his book appeared in English. So interesting story. To continue, he says that, and this is on page 281, he says, the thesis that I'm advancing with 100% conviction, there's that word conviction again, is that every Hermeticist who truly seeks authentic spiritual reality will sooner or later meet the Blessed Virgin. Let me say that again. sooner or later, I'm sorry, every Hermeticist who truly seeks authentic spiritual reality will sooner or later meet the Blessed Virgin. And I think it's true. I know it's true. Now, how does that? It doesn't mean she shows up at your house, knocks on the door, rings the doorbell. No, but I think you do. You get it. I mean, I think this is what led me to Sophiology. You know, the seeds planted in this book many years ago, and then it took 20, at least 20 years, about 20 years, till it really flowered. And I really, it didn't really flower in me until I was in my 40s, probably. And I'm going to say that, and how I would describe that meeting of the Virgin, it's not, not like the little children of Lourdes or the other kinds of apparitions. It wasn't an apparition, but it was certainly a meeting. And from there, Tomberg moves into a discussion of a couple lines from the Emerald Table. Remember, the first is, "It overcometh every subtle thing." And for him, it has several meanings, but he touches on apokatastasis, the redemption of all. And he sees this in the image on the card, where the subtle is where the Virgin is overcoming the lion, right? And for him, he talks about, going to apokatastasis. It is likewise true that the devil will be overcome only at the moment when his voice, no matter whether it is rough or smooth, will be heard in chorus with the choirs of celestial hierarchies praising God. Some would call that heretical, but, apokatastasis is, as I said before, it's something that Sophiology leads one to. It's almost unavoidable, I would say. I haven't encountered a Sophiology that does not intrude upon the idea of apokatastasis, right? And he says, page 23, "To overcome every subtle thing is therefore equivalent to changing opposing forces, mental, psychic, and electrical, into friendly and allied forces." Right? And this is what Hermeticism is supposed to do. This is Hermeticism's relationship to science is supposed to overcome it that way. Right? Not to make it a friend. To make science a friend. As he says, it's a healing agent, Hermeticism. Right. And then he moves into the second statement from the Emerald Table. "It doth penetrate every solid substance." Right? Solidity is the experience of an obstacle to our freedom of movement. Right? So how do we do this? And he gives an example of trying to convince a Marxist or a Freudian of anything. We've had these conversations. It doesn't have to be Marxist. Those are the obstinate people in his age. It's a lot. We have a lot more available to us now, and they seem impenetrable. But he says, what the answer to this is what he calls an emollient action, which is the opposite of an explosion. And he says, "The heart having tasted life, the creative movement of life will pass its breath to the head and will breathe movement into the mental formation. The latter, having been set in motion, not by doubt, but rather by creative elan, will lose its rigidity and we become fluid. It is thus that the liquefaction of crystallized mental formations is effected, right? With respect to psychic obstacles, it is again emollient action which affects the transformation of a psychic complex from rigidity into sensitivity. Here again, it is the breath of life which dissolves the complex by way of the heart, so that the mistrust, fear, or hate concentrated in the complex is dispersed, and the soul is left free of the blinding influence of the psychic complex. And lastly, he says, physical obstacles exist for force, that is, for the radiation of life, only insofar as they are due to morbid processes of crystallization of living organisms. And this is emollient action. And he says later, of course, that this is through the heart. This is through the Hermetic practice of the heart. And it's also through resisting polemic, which he talked about earlier, right? Because you get it, you just, it's like the tar baby. You touch it, and you're involved with it. You're stuck. So to avoid it is to walk the Hermetic path. And then Tomberg talks about these two different ways of sleep, two different ways of dying. And it's interesting that, and it's two different ways of dying, and I think this is what I'd like to concentrate on a little bit. He says that the one is where the body refuses to serve as the instrument for the soul, which is the case with sclerosis, right? Hardening. The other is where the principle which vivifies and animates the body retires and is thus missed by the body. It is then when the soul which quits the body. Now, especially with this idea of sclerosis, which kind of permeates much of his discussion or critique throughout the rest of this letter, and this hardening, right? How do you avoid this hardening? How do you maintain the emollient action? Because everybody's going to die, And remember we talked earlier about the death of William Blake compared to the death of Aleister Crowley. Now, interesting, with Crowley, his arteries were so hard that they couldn't even get a needle into his veins. So there's an example of sclerosis, and then one of his last words, "I am confused." Whereas Blake went out singing of angels and the glories he saw in heaven. Now, and this is, I think, particularly important, what I'm going to read, is regards our age. And Tomberg wrote this probably around 1965 or so. And he said, "It is said that the West is growing old." This is page 292. But why? Because it lacks creative elan. Because it has turned away from the source of creative elan. Because it has turned away from the virgin. Without virginity, there is no springtime. There is neither freshness nor youth. For this reason, it is regrettable that most of the authors and doctors of contemporary occultism also side with the dethroners of the Virgin. Thus they turn towards scientism, toward knowledge which unveils and undresses, and they turn away from wisdom, that is, from knowledge which is veiled and dressed with symbols, which is not due to scrutinizing observation, but rather to revelatory worship. Right? This is, I think, so important. And I think, I wonder even if the upsurge in dementia and Alzheimer's has something to do with this lack of creative elan, this abandoning of the Virgin. And it's interesting, though, and I think even with the rise of feminism, I'm not sure. I shouldn't say I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that part of that, at least in some quarters of it, was also an abandoning of the Virgin, right? Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, really hated Faust in the end because Faust wasn't punished for what he did to Gretchen, and that in fact Gretchen forgave him in the last scene of Faust Part 2, from the spiritual world, which seems to me more accurate to the spiritual world, how the spiritual world acts, and how what Christianity teaches, but it's not good enough. And of course, a lot of feminists resented the picture of the Virgin Mary as a virgin, or or whatever. Now, I'm not here to rip on feminism, but I'm just pointing out that there are aspects of that which have actually rejected the Virgin. In fact, there's some hostility to the Virgin in some feminist quarters. On the other hand, there's some deep of devotion to the Virgin as well. So it's a mixed bag, I guess, at best. But his critique of Hermeneus, and this is what scientists do. Mary Midgley and Pierre Hadot, I think I mentioned earlier in one of the videos, they both also were concerned with science's, pillage and rape methodology, that torturing nature to get her secrets from her. And Tom was saying the same thing about some Hermeticists here, or some occultists here, right? They turn towards scientism, towards knowledge which unveils and undresses, and they turn away from wisdom, from knowledge which is revealed and dressed with symbols, which is due not to scrutinizing observation, but rather to revelatory worship. It's all, and you probably met them. Some occultists, it's like worship is, they're above worship. That's for plebeians. And it's Hans Urs von Balthasar notes the same thing in a way in theology. He compares it theology at the desk to theology on its knees. And of course, he supports theology on its knees. And then he gets into a long discussion of Hermeticism and its relationship to traditionalism, we could say. I mean, not in the hard traditionalism, but honoring thy father and mother, as in not, and becoming an iconophile, and not an iconoclast, not in rejecting what we have inherited, but in loving what we have inherited, and honoring it. Right? And this is again what he says. So what's the answer? And now he also brings in some more discussion of Kabbalah and Vedanta, and he knows what the critique is, and he says, "Is this therefore syncretism?" This is page 294. No, he says, but thanks should be accorded to those to whom it's due. To deny is to kill, and this is part of honor your father and mother, right? To forget is to bury. To honor and to appreciate is to preserve living. To restore to memory is to recall to life. In honoring much, Hermeticism participates in the life of much. Therefore, it is much life. It is to this that Hermeticism owes its longevity. And he goes on. For force is life, and longevity is an important aspect of it. The Virgin is not only the source of a creative elan, but also of spiritual longevity. This is why the West, in turning away more and more from the Virgin, is growing old, his emphasis. That is, distancing itself from the rejuvenating source of longevity. Each revolution which has taken place in the West, that of the Reformation, the French Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the delirium of nationalism, the Communist Revolution, has advanced the process of aging in the West, because each has signified a further distancing from the principle of the Virgin. In other words, Our Lady is Our Lady, and is not to be replaced with impunity either by the goddess reason, or by the goddess biological evolution, or by the goddess economy, or by the goddess, I would say. Right? And then to finish up, and on the same token, he spends the rest of the letter is actually on basically on these topics of should you have do Vedanta and Buddhist stuff, and he says, applying methods is okay. Changing faith is something altogether different, right? Right? In fact, here's on page 298. So, for nothing is more natural and legitimate than to learn and make use of the benefits of experiences accumulated in East or West. If Western medicine saves the lives of millions in the East, why should not Oriental yoga help millions in the West? And of course, we know a lot of mainstream Catholics would have a freak out moment right there. And then he continues, what he calls, but you can do that, but you can't, exchange Christ for the Buddha. That would be what he calls spiritual adultery. The exchange of a higher moral and spiritual value for a lower moral and spiritual value. On page 299. It is, for example, the exchange of the living God for an impersonal deity or divinity. Christ crucified and resurrected for a sage deep in meditation. The Holy Virgin Mother for nature and evolution. The community of saints, apostles, martyrs, monks, confessors, church doctors, and virgins for a community of geniuses of philosophy, art, and science. And he's not saying that those other things aren't worthy, but he says, don't exchange what is best for what is good. Because there's a diminishment, and it's also denying your father and mother, and it's ultimately denying Christ and Sophia. And he says, and I think this is one of the beautiful things about Tomberg and his approach to Hermeticism at the very end, page 300. He says, particular spiritual schools and traditions should not, in order to live, be rivals, but should live in the consciousness of the kinship of their cause and ideals. If there is kinship, or if there is not, they should respect the domain of freedom of the other, the house proper to it, without mixing this with envy or criticism. If there is no cooperation resulting from kinship of causes and ideals, then spiritual traditions and schools should live and let live in peace. This now, he does. I don't think he mentions in many places, but he might. Thomas Merton. So this was Thomas Merton's approach. He kind of had the soul of a Hermeticist because he appreciated Buddhist forms of meditation and contemplation, but he knew they weren't Christian, and he wasn't trying, as much as people accuse him of it, he wasn't trying to be a syncretist. He was honoring what he found there, much as Tomberg is honoring what he found there here. And likewise, Thomas Merton had a deep, deep, deep life of contemplation and prayer, which is where all these insights came from. And he was also very interested in incorporating both the Spanish mystics like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross with what he found in the Russian Sophiologists, because he saw, he heard the voice of God through them, So, I guess to leave you then, I would leave you just to think, to take into deep consideration what Tomberg says about natural religion and the disenclosure that comes with adoration. Or as Goethe, or not Goethe, as Rilke says in one of his poems, praising is what matters. See you next time.